We're coming on the air with a big promise from the head of the FDA that this baby formula crisis could start to get better in the next couple days, maybe get back to normal in the next couple weeks. But some parents are saying, hey, that's not fast enough. Coming up, my conversation with one senator who says the FDA is to blame big time. Plus, what's up with Wall Street? Experts worried the markets could lose a fifth of their record value. We'll tell you what the White House's top economic advisor is telling me coming up. And the CDC is looking into a rare case of the monkeypox here in the U.S. And while the idea of any virus spreading might freak you out right now, we've got the gut check on why you shouldn't. Plus, when is an elephant also a human? I mean, I get how that sounds, but that's what a New York judge is getting asked right now. Why Happy the elephant is getting her day in court. And Boeing's now getting in on the private sector's space race. Why some say today might be make or break for the company. We're getting into that later on in the show. Hey there, I'm Hallie, and right now, at least one way to try to get a handle on this baby formula crisis is heading to President Biden's desk as we're learning more about how this shortage is affecting more kids and their desperate parents. Just today, we're hearing from a hospital down in Atlanta that a few patients got admitted because they didn't have enough of a specialty formula that these kids need. This is such a complex thing, right? Because even older kids can rely on formula. And as the parent of one 11-year-old who needs it explains, what the government is doing, she says, is just not enough.
They're speaking about, oh, you could use cow's milk or you can do this temporarily, but we're talking about an 11-year-old. And are you going to get this going within the next week?
The FDA commissioner, who just today got peppered with questions from a House subcommittee, is saying within the next week might not be totally realistic.
So I can tell my constituents that within a matter of days, they'll be able to find formula on the shelves?
It will gradually get better. Within days, it will get better, but it will be a few weeks before we're back to normal.
Hallie is joining me now live from Capitol Hill. So, Hallie, I just had a conversation with Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who's got her own bill on baby formula that she's backing. I asked her if she put that out because she thinks the White House isn't doing enough. And she pointed her finger very squarely at the FDA. Watch. Are you introducing this legislation, Senator, because you don't think the White House's actions go far enough?
Well, I think the FDA has failed from the beginning. First of all, this started with a whistleblower in October, and it took the FDA till February to shut down Abbott Nutrition for the kind of safety violations that have resulted in the death of infants and the illness of infants.
Hallie, that's pretty much in line what we heard in today's hearing, right? When the FDA commissioner was, in a hot seat is very cliche to say. But let's be real, that seat was hot.
Yeah, and those words from Senator Kirsten Gillibrand are coming after last week she told NPR actually that she's received dozens of letters from her constituents just explaining how dire the shortage is, telling her their personal stories about their search of some of them going hundreds of miles in search of this baby formula. And we saw the same from several lawmakers on this committee in this virtual hearing with the FDA commissioner today. House Appropriations Chairwoman Rosa DeLauro actually specifically had some very passionate words demanding answers for really why it took so long for the alarm to be raised about this issue and what sorts of infrastructure could be put in place so that this crisis never gets this bad again. You've even had House Speaker Nancy Pelosi this week suggest that there could be several indictments for how bad this issue is, that just the fact that there were several infant deaths alone, she says, is reason enough to call for several indictments, Hallie.
You also look at what Congress is doing to try to make things better right now, right? Not just the White House, which is putting in place this Operation Fly formula to try to get more formula on the shelves, but what Congress is doing. The Senate has passed one of the bills the House did to help low-income families get more access to formula, but it doesn't look like they're going to approve this $28 million to help fund the FDA. Why not?
Yeah, so this bill was much more divided in the House. You had all House Republicans last night voting in favor of this, but very few Republicans voting in favor of this. And that's because Republicans are saying that they really don't know where this money is going to go. They're saying that there are this $28 million could go to several other crises that the American people are facing. And so there's still disagreements over exactly where this money can go. But there is a general consensus here on Capitol Hill that more more needs to be done. We've seen several House committees launch investigations into what is going on, how this crisis got so bad. We've seen senators send letters to the Infant Nutrition Council, even demanding answers. Several hearings are also scheduled as a follow-up next week to get more answers to this. So even though there was a Republican pushback last night, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is saying he hopes this will pass. But as we've seen with so much legislation in this 50-50 Senate, there could be Republican roadblocks along the way.
This is just so emotional, I think, for so many parents. We saw some of it right at the top of the show, right? A mom who's like, what am I supposed to do here? We've seen that again and again. Some parents near tears because they're trying to get their babies the formula that they need. What is the long-term fix, right? Because the FDA commissioner is coming out today and saying, okay, matter of weeks, it's going to get better. That doesn't change the underlying structural issues, right? The fact that there are only really 4 formula manufacturers who supply most of the formula in this country. It doesn't change the structural system that puts this industry at risk in the first place of having a crisis like this.
That's right, and that's one of the things that was brought up to the FDA commissioner today. What sorts of things can be put in place long term? And he said that if this funding is approved, some improvements that could be made on the FDA's part is that they will hire more inspectors, more scientists to be able to test more product at a given time, especially as this Michigan plant prepares to reopen in an estimated time frame, 2 weeks, depending on whether they check all of these standards protocols by the FDA. That's that agreement that was agreed to earlier this week. But this isn't the last we're going to see of the FDA commissioner. There's actually an Energy and Commerce hearing scheduled for May 25th, where he will appear again, as well as heads of the 4 major top manufacturing companies for baby formula to answer more of these questions, Hallie.
Hallie, Rafa, thank you so much. Good to see you. Let's go to Wall Street now, where some folks are worried we're getting closer to a bear market, which is when stock prices drop 20% off their record high. And look at the big board. You've got all 3 markets ending up in the red today. The Dow's down something like 235 points. The S&P and the NASDAQ now down just a tick. Listen, here's the thing. To be fair, in the macro, in the big picture, historically, the markets are doing way better than they've ever done before. But if you look at just this year, any gains from 2022 are totally wiped out. Look at this. All 3 markets down by double digits for the year. Jake Ward is joining us now. And Jake, there has been increasingly, I think, this drumbeat over the last week or so of experts coming out predicting the risk of recession. These are smart people who work in the industry, who work in the markets, whose job it is to do this. The White House top economic advisor Brian Deese told me about 2 hours ago, not even, he thinks the economy is resilient. He thinks you're seeing resiliency in the market. So where's the reality, right? What should we be anticipating down the road?
Well, I think what you're saying here is so smart about the big picture, right? We are in these record highs when it comes to levels of employment, when it comes to the amount of money being made on the stock market. All of that is unprecedented. Stagflation, which we've heard both former Fed chairs Janet Yellen and Ben Bernanke talk about in the last little while. That's historically times when inflation is accompanied by high unemployment. We don't have that right now. Employment is not really our problem, but inflation is definitely a thing. And so there's really this sort of unprecedented combination of factors we're seeing right now that's leading big retailers like Target, Walmart, Kohl's to report these really disappointing earnings. And, part of it is just that they couldn't get out in front of the market. So the combination of all these different factors, right, of the pandemic, the supply chain crisis, the oil crisis, all of these things coming together is, I think, putting us in totally uncharted territory here, Hallie.
It seems like a lot of the things that we use, you're making a point here, Jake, about how some of the tools that we use to try to predict demand or economic health, et cetera, have been totally thrown into flux by a global pandemic, a war, in Russia, in Ukraine, propagated by Russia. Like, are we flying blind?
I think for me, the thing that I'm realizing as I watch all of this happening is just how fragile the system is and how fragile the systems are that we have used to make these kinds of forecasts in the past. Target, for instance, is a company that's famous for being able to tell that someone is pregnant by their buying patterns almost before they know that they are pregnant, right? The predictive systems that we have used in this country have been incredible up until now. But then you just have a little change, like a slightly colder spring season, right? Which is something that we just had. And suddenly all the wicker furniture that Walmart and Target expected to sell just sits there, right? That kind of thing can just blow everything up in an instant. And the fact that we are, as you say, at these record places when it comes to employment, when it comes to the stock market, means we're in uncharted territory.
Yeah.
So the idea that we can use economic models to predict the future because they predicted because they've worked in the past, I don't know that that's entirely true here. So we're just trying to figure it out.
Jake Ward, thank you for that breakdown. Appreciate it. As we've been on the air, just in the studio in the last 10 minutes, we've gotten a new response, brand new just into us, to this interesting and newsy new ask from the January 6th Select Committee, wanting to know more about a tour that they say happened in the Capitol the day before January 6th, given by a Republican lawmaker. And they now want that congressman to come in front of them. They want him to answer some questions about it. We're talking about Barry Loudermilk of Georgia. And in a letter, the Select Committee said, according to public reporting and witness accounts, there were what they say individuals and groups engaged in efforts to get info on the layout of the U.S. Capitol, of the House and Senate office buildings before the attack. They say there's evidence now that contradicts what Republicans, including Congressman Loudermilk, initially said, that there were no tours, no loud groups, et cetera, in the Capitol before the insurrection. As we've been on the air, we've heard now from two Republican lawmakers, including Congressman Loudermilk. I want to bring in NBC's Garrett Haake, who's joining me now to talk about this. And it sounds like they are saying they want Capitol Police to release tapes from January 5th. I assume, Garrett, and listen, I've skimmed this because we've literally been on the air when this came out, but I assume it's because they believe those tapes will show that Loudermilk did no such tour, gave no such tour.
Yeah, that's right, Hallie. This is Rodney Davis and Barry Loudermilk. Rodney Davis is the ranking member on the administration committee, so would have some oversight responsibility here on this issue, essentially calling the January 6th committee's bluff. They say in this statement that there were no nefarious tours going on. They talk about, showing around constituent families with small children. The statement says that Loudermilk didn't bring anyone into the Capitol itself. And the two Republicans here push back. They remind readers that they've filed an ethics complaint against Democrats who have suggested the possibility that the tours that might have been happening in the lead up to the 6th were somehow nefarious. And they, as you say, call on Capitol Police to release any tapes they might have from the Capitol in the days leading up to the 6th that would show these tours. So, how we got here, obviously the committee says they've got evidence that these kinds of tours took place. That could be tapes. There is plenty of surveillance all around this complex. It could also be from witnesses, of which they've interviewed more than 1,000. And really in the last 30 minutes, I've already seen one tweet from a staffer responding to this request for Loudermilk to come and talk, saying that he was one of the people who saw Loudermilk give this tour. So there's a lot going on out here about what these tours were or were not. And I think what this is ultimately going to come down to is, what do the tapes show? January 6th committee likely has them. The Capitol Police certainly do. And how and in what format are they released? Because these Republicans say, don't wait for some hearing to drop this on us. If you've got the goods, let's see it.
This letter seems to suggest that whatever Loudermilk did may have involved, according to this letter, a constituent family with young children meeting with their member in the House office buildings. They're trying to, I think, downplay it to that degree, right, given that the Select Committee has made this request. And it's important to note here, Garrett, this isn't a subpoena. There's no legal muscle behind this, the way we saw last week when 5 Republican lawmakers were subpoenaed, including Kevin McCarthy, the top Republican in the House. But it is still a request for basically one of their own, right, from these members of Congress to one of their own to come in and talk.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple things happening here. I mean, we are inside of a month now until the January 6th committee's hearings are expected to start, when they're going to start laying out their evidence. So what I think part of what you're seeing here is them clearing the decks here a little bit. Everything that they've got, every answer that they still want, they're going to ask for. And when I read between the lines a little bit here on their ask, what it says to me, if I were to translate this into plain English, it's, we've got the goods. We have video of you giving a tour to somebody here. Do you want to come talk to us about it now, or do you want to see it on national TV during the hearings? That's sort of what I feel like is going on here. And I think with the pushback here from the Republicans is like, all right, fine, then let's see the tapes now. Let's not go through this whole kabuki theater between now and when these hearings start. Do I expect Loudermilk to come talk to the committee? Absolutely not. I think the Republicans have presented a united front in not participating here. But I think part of that response from the two Republicans in this letter is to try to take some of the wind out of the sails of whatever the committee might be setting up by even asking for this testimony that they know they're not going to get.
Our chief Congress speak to plain English translator, Garrett Haake, thank you. It's great to have that breakdown, man. Appreciate you being with us. So not too long ago, Actually, in just the last couple hours, we heard from officials in Buffalo who say they've wrapped up the investigation at the scene of that racist attack at a supermarket there that ended in the deaths of 10 people. It comes as the suspect in those deaths was shouted down during his court appearance today. Watch.
Hey, you're a coward.
That outburst coming at the end of a really short hearing. It was only like 4 minutes long, in which the judge ordered the accused shooter to be held without bail after he was indicted by a grand jury. You see him, he was handcuffed, surrounded by about a half dozen sheriff's deputies. He previously pleaded not guilty to a charge of first-degree murder, and more charges are expected. Ron Allen joins us now. It's been a pretty active scene there in Buffalo. It feels like it has been covered there, that top supermarket, with law enforcement over the past 5 days. But now that piece of the investigation is wrapping up. This is a different phase and stage of the investigation, Ron.
Law enforcement is gone. The evidence collecting phase of it is over. You can see there's a fence that's been put up around it by some contractors, and the property was handed back to Tops Markets. The president of the company was here. They are now going to try to repair whatever damage there is in there. And I asked the FBI to explain it and to describe it, and they really won't. And there's no estimate in terms of months, weeks, how long it will take to get this place back open and deal with the aftermath and the emotional aftermath as well. Will people want to go back to shop there? Will employees want to go back to work there? Tops is saying that they're going to do everything they can to make that happen because this is such a vital part of this community. It's the only food store, full-service food store with fresh meats and produce and vegetables for miles. It's a food desert that we're still in here. Yes, the hearing today was brief, and there's still just that one charge, that one murder charge. And when you ask why, it's because, on the one hand, while we think we know what happened, we saw what happened in this awful incident, the federal and state prosecutors are putting together a very detailed case based on a lot of evidence. It's a lot of video. There's hundreds of pages of postings and messages on social media from the suspect. There are witness statements that have to be taken. There are forensic investigations and analysis that has to be done. So they're putting together a very, very careful hour by hour, minute by minute, second by second even, analysis of the story of what happened here, as the FBI put it, before there will be more charges, which we expect in the coming days and weeks. It may take a while, but those charges that could be domestic terrorism on the state level and could be hate crimes or the death penalty on the federal level, those charges seem inevitable.
We're also hearing this disturbing story from a store employee who said she called 911. She says only to have the dispatcher yell at her and hang up. What's going on there? What's happening with this dispatcher? What are police saying?
It's really just really very chilling. This is a woman who was in the store hiding when the gunman came in, heard the gunman, called 911, and was whispering to try and keep her voice down for obvious reasons. The dispatcher says that she couldn't hear her. The dispatcher seems to get frustrated. Here's the woman's version of what happened when she was talking to the operator. Take a listen.
She proceeded in a very nasty tone and says, "I can't hear you. Why are you whispering? You don't have to whisper. They can't hear you." So I continued to whisper, and I said, "Ma'am, he's still in the store. He's still shooting. I'm scared for my life. Please send help." Out of nervousness, my phone fell out my hand. She said something I couldn't make out, and then the phone hung up.
That dispatcher is now on administrative leave, and the supervisors there at the county level, which runs this call center, essentially said that they have every expectation that she will be terminated after a hearing happens and due process happens by the end of the month. Fortunately, or however you want to look at this, the police arrived relatively quickly. We know that the security guard here acted heroically, firing at the gunman, couldn't take him down, was killed himself because of the body armor that the suspect had on. Could this have been much worse? Obviously. There were many, many people in the store. But again, this is just one chilling aspect of what happened to all the horror stories that are emerging from that day.
Ron Allen, live for us outside that Tops supermarket in Buffalo. Ron, thank you for being there. You know, there seem to be multiple warning signs from this suspect in the Buffalo supermarket shooting. So how can officers recognize the potential for an attack before it happens? We're going to take a closer look at how some people think attacks like what happened in Buffalo can be prevented later on in the show with our original. To Ukraine now, overseas, where new aid money is coming from the U.S. on a couple of fronts. First, you've got the Pentagon just announcing a new round of military equipment valued at $100 million. That is headed overseas. And that came right after the Senate finally passed that $40 billion package for Ukraine we've been talking about for days now. This bill will mean more money, not just economically, but also more humanitarian help for refugees. It comes as President Biden today was with leaders from Sweden and Finland endorsing their push to join NATO, saying they meet every requirement and then some. The head of NATO today says he expects to resolve Turkey's concerns about them joining. This is a big deal, right? Because this is exactly what Russia did not want to see. Two countries that had previously maintained a level of neutrality when it came to Russia, now siding with NATO. What about what's happening on the ground? Russia is saying another 700 Ukrainian fighters have surrendered at that steel plant in Mariupol. They are now in Russian-controlled territory, where we're seeing what you're seeing now, new video of them getting paraded through the streets. The war in Ukraine is also prompting some changes on Twitter. Starting today, it's not going to automatically recommend or emphasize posts that make false claims about Russia's invasion. The company's hoping to really clamp down on posts that mischaracterize what's happening in war zones. Tweets that violate this policy will have a warning, but they're not going to be removed right away. The policy will also add warning labels to debunked claims about other humanitarian crises as well. For the president, it is absolutely an issue of trying to walk and chew gum at the same time on the international stage, right? Because as he's dealing with Ukraine, he's also now on his way to meet with South Korea and Japanese leaders on his first trip to Asia as president. So, you know, trade, investment, supply chain stuff, that's going to be on the table, along with tensions in the region. You've got North Korea, with U.S. officials saying there's a real possibility that country will conduct a ballistic or nuclear test while the president is overseas. Then there's China. Last month, they held military drills around Taiwan. Japan has said they've sent military vessels into its territorial waters. And in March, U.S. intelligence found China was willing to give Russia military and financial help to try to soften the blow of those sanctions from the West after the invasion of Ukraine. Mike Memoli is with me now. There's always a lot on any president's plate, Mike, but this is a particularly interesting moment for President Biden because he is focusing, right? China, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, but also Russia and Ukraine. What are you hearing from the folks you're talking to behind the scenes about how the president is going to have one eye on this trip and the other eye on Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky?
Well, Hallie, it's so interesting because when you do talk to White House officials, they really say there's a common thread here, right? And that's Biden's view that all foreign policy comes down to this test of the 21st century between autocracies like China and like Russia and democracies like the United States. And so you start where the president did today in Washington, welcoming Sweden and Finland into that NATO alliance. Right. And then you look at his agenda here. He's trying to strengthen what's called the Quad alliance. That's the U.S., Japan, India, Australia, the democracies in the Indo-Pacific region, all with an eye towards countering China's growing influence in the region. The president's agenda here, obviously, as you mentioned, focused on North Korea, some of the other regional security issues. Jake Sullivan just on the plane with reporters with the president coming over here saying, yes, it is possible that North Korea could do some provocation here, launch a missile test. But he said that would really only prove the president's point that we need to be more engaged in this region, not less.
What do you see as potentially the biggest moment for President Biden while he is overseas on this multi-day Asia trip?
Well, it's so interesting because a lot of this is going to be about, right, foreign policy, diplomacy. Yeah. But one of the president's first stops here I find interesting is about domestic politics, the economy back home. The president's been pushing this legislation to try to jumpstart the advanced manufacturing industry. And his first stop here is going to be at a business that has plans to expand its operations in the U.S. should that happen. But a lot of these trips, there's the planned and then there's the unplanned. Sure. I think North Korea, should there be a test, the biggest one. But also that meeting he's going to have as part of the Quad with India's Prime Minister Modi. That's important as it ties back to the issue of Ukraine because they've been, in the U.S.'s view, too friendly towards Russia at a time. They're trying to get democracies to confront Russia.
Mike Memoli, live for us there in Seoul, South Korea, where it is just breakfast time. Mike, thank you for staying up all night for us. Appreciate it. Glad to see you. I'm sure we'll talk tomorrow. New developments in the federal criminal investigation of President Biden's son, Hunter, into his finances and his work overseas. We're learning now he's paid off a multi-million-dollar tax bill he owed. With now questions about what this investigation might mean for Hunter Biden legally and politically for President Biden. It comes as an NBC News analysis of Hunter Biden's hard drive and iCloud accounts adds to the scrutiny over how the president's son made his money. With federal prosecutors poring over Hunter Biden's finances, investigating whether he violated federal tax law, this morning a representative for the president's son tells NBC News his IRS bill totaling about $2 million has been paid off. Two people familiar with the matter say the money was arranged by one of the younger Biden's new attorneys, Hollywood lawyer Kevin Morris, best known for brokering a deal for the South Park TV show.
Does paying that tax bill wash away any liability that Hunter Biden may have now?
Paying the tax bill, if in fact that's what he did, doesn't undo the crime. It would be like returning money to a bank that you robbed. You still robbed the bank.
The president's son and his company brought in about $11 million between 2013 and 2018, working as an attorney, a board member to a Ukrainian gas company accused of bribing a prosecutor, and for a joint venture involving a Chinese businessman now accused of fraud, according to an NBC News analysis of a copy of Biden's hard drive and iCloud account obtained by NBC from a representative for Rudy Giuliani, as well as documents released by a Senate committee. During the campaign, then candidate Biden denied his son profited off a China connection.
My son has not made money in terms of this thing about, what are you talking about, China.
The records show Hunter Biden's company received nearly $5 million in consulting contracts from that joint venture funded by a Chinese energy company. A snapshot of Hunter Biden's spending shows that for about 5 months in late 2017 and early 2018, he spent more than $200,000 a month on things like luxury hotel rooms, cash withdrawals, dental work, and payments on a Porsche, according to documents on the hard drive, a time period in which Hunter Biden has acknowledged struggling with drug addiction. His laptop itself, a subject of controversy after documents recovered from it were brought to light by the Biden's political opponents. And with the chain of custody in question, in 2020, some experts suggested the laptop's contents bore hallmarks of a Russian disinformation campaign. Since then, several news organizations have authenticated many emails from the laptop. The president has defended his son.
Are you confident that Hunter did nothing wrong?
I'm confident.
And Hunter Biden has denied any illegal business dealings.
I'm cooperating completely. And I am absolutely certain, 100% certain, that at the end of the investigation, that I will be cleared of any wrongdoing.
Hunter Biden's attorney did not comment on the record, and the White House has not responded to our request for comment. Experts point out that family members of a president who hold no official job in the administration are not bound by any government ethics rules. I want to bring in Tom Winter, who led the reporting team on this, basically did the heavy lifting. Tom, I'm glad to be with you here. What did experts tell you about the significance of this investigation and a potential timeline here?
Right, a couple of different things, Hallie. First off, no decisions have been made yet whether or not to charge Hunter Biden in connection with this ongoing federal criminal investigation. That the tax component of it is a significant part of it. We've been told, I think, a couple of things to keep in mind here. Number one, we're covering this in part because the income and where it comes from is such an important thing here. And so while, as you pointed out, Hunter Biden is free to make money, he's a private citizen. He's free to work for who he wants to work for. I think an important thing here are some of the companies that he was tied up with, including a joint venture funded by a Chinese national oil and natural gas company. The person who was in charge of that company has disappeared after Chinese authorities accused him of fraud. He hasn't been seen in public since. We contacted the Chinese embassy. They said, we don't even know what you're talking about. So that's an interesting development in really analyzing the income here as far as how much he was paid versus how much he was able to do. And I think that's an important part of this. We just were not able to find an awful lot of output. In other words, deals that were closed, things that were progressed on behalf of the folks that were funding him and funding his company. So that's one of the other things that we examined.
Tom, I think you know the ethos of the show in many ways is just to be, I think, really transparent and we don't exist in a vacuum, and we know that. And there has been some response to this story, and I want to ask you about that because some of the response has been a little bit, hey, well, you know, and I'm paraphrasing here, you're looking at President Biden's adult child. Why didn't you look at former President Trump's adult children when they actually did, some of them, serve in office and have formal roles in the administration?
It's a fair point to note that Hunter Biden is not part of the Biden administration and that Trump's children are. And so that does have a distinction, but that also misses a key fact, which is the significant amount of investigative reporting that this news organization did as it pertains to Trump children, as it pertains to Jared Kushner. First to report that Jared Kushner was under investigation by the special counsel Robert Mueller. We did a significant, and I was part of it, significant deep dive into Ivanka Trump and the business she was doing in China and the fact that many items in her clothing line were manufactured there. For instance, I could go on, and we have covered on numerous occasions the legal fights that have occurred and the investigations that have occurred that have not only been involved with former President Donald Trump, but also his children. You and I have talked about it on this program many times before. So one of the things that we do need to do is whoever is in office to pay attention to whoever is in office. And given Hunter Biden's foreign business ties, Ukraine, obviously incredibly topical in the news right now, as well as business interests with China, we have to pay attention to those issues, and that's why we are spending some time on it.
Tom Winter, it's great to see you. Great reporting. Thank you for being with us. Coming up, a rare case of monkeypox in the U.S. has some people worried. So should you be? Experts say not so much. We're going to explain why. Plus, the Oklahoma legislature just passed the country's strictest abortion bill yet. We've got more on that coming up in the 5 Things. The CDC, just in the last hour, is now approving a 3rd dose of the Pfizer vaccine for kids ages 5 to 11, a booster, basically. That advisory panel vote follows the FDA's recommendation from a couple days ago, remember earlier this week. The decision also means that immunocompromised kids who have already received a 3rd dose would be eligible to get a 4th shot. Parents might be able to start getting their kids' booster doses as early as this weekend. We're going to watch that. We're also watching the CDC investigating a rare case of monkeypox in the U.S. We first told you about it here on the show last night, and since then, interest on the topic has exploded online. Here's what we know. A case was discovered in a man in Massachusetts who had recently been to Canada. Doctors there say the symptoms are usually kind of vague, like maybe a fever, maybe some muscle aches. But in this case, the symptoms had gotten worse. And then the monkeypox was diagnosed when they noticed lesions on the patient.
This patient, fortunately, is doing quite well now, although did have had symptoms that required the hospitalization.
I would emphasize that historically this has been a very rare disease with very rare transmission around the world. The current patient is of no public health risk right now.
The CDC is also tracking a handful of cases in Britain, in Portugal, in Spain, places that don't typically report monkeypox. Erica Edwards is joining us now to give us the facts. And frankly, Erica, a bit of a gut check here, right? Because this, I think, people hear monkeypox, it's like, oh my gosh, really, right? But the freak out level doesn't need to be cranked to a 10 here. Is that fair?
I would say that's fair. I mean, but let's break down these issues one at a time and really kind of get the facts out there. First of all, this is not like, dare we say, COVID, in that it's not a new virus, not a new disease. Scientists have been studying this for decades. They know a lot about it. It does not spread easily from person to person. You have to be in really, really close contact with a person to become infected yourself. However, it's quite rare. Generally, we don't see this outside of parts of Central and West Africa. On the map there, you can actually now add Canada to the list of countries now with suspected cases. And doctors are concerned that perhaps this virus has been spreading undetected or perhaps being misdiagnosed in doctor's office because it is so rare. Now, we do anticipate additional cases will be seen here in the U.S. In fact, I saw an email that doctors at NYU Langone got earlier today from their infectious disease experts saying, yeah, listen, be on the lookout. It's probably will see cases, at least in New York City, in the coming days. I can also tell you that it's rarely deadly, but for the most part, these cases have resolved on their own within about a month. And doctors tell me that there is no widespread threat to the general public.
How transmissible is it, Erica?
It's not very transmissible at all.
So it's not like you said, it's not COVID. It's not like you breathe on, that type of thing where if you're close to somebody for 15 minutes, you could be at risk.
This is spread through bodily fluids, and you have to be very, very close, especially to those lesions that we were talking about. Now, I Google interesting medical things here for a living, and I can tell you that if you've seen this pox, these lesions, if you've seen pictures of them, if you see them then on your body, you're not going to miss it. Generally, they start on your face, go to your palms, potentially other parts of your body. Now, there are a few red flags. I know you mentioned earlier that flu-like symptoms, but there are some red flags. That unexplained rash that we were talking about, people who have been outside of the country traveling in areas where these suspected cases have been. I'll also I know we saw it on the graphic earlier. A lot of these cases have been reported among men who have sex with men. However, it is extremely critical that we do not stigmatize any one group. Monkeypox is not known to be a sexually transmitted disease. In all likelihood, those cases occurred because, as we were talking about, that very, very close contact with someone else, especially those lesions. That's why doctors really need to be looking for these cases among anybody. And, right now there's really no treatment. But like I said, they generally resolve on their own. If there were to be an outbreak, in the past, doctors have used, in fact, the smallpox vaccine to control those outbreaks. Hallie?
Erica Edwards, a great breakdown of the facts, what we need to know, and how we should think about this. Thank you so much. Let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, bad floods have forced more than half a million people out of their homes in one of India's northeastern states. You can see it here. Torrential rain has hammered more than 1,500 villages. Officials say thousands of people are trapped. They worry that conditions could get even worse this week. Number 2, lawmakers in Oklahoma just passed a bill that would ban abortion at conception. It's now headed to the governor's desk, and if he signs it into law, this would become the most restrictive abortion ban in the country. It would take effect immediately. Number 3, Illinois is now the first state in the Midwest to ban ghost guns. The governor there signed that bill yesterday. We've told you about ghost guns before, how they're made from parts that could be untraceable. Governor Pritzker says the goal is to try to crack down on gun violence. Number 4, Ford is recalling 39,000 of its large SUVs over risks of engine fire. It's also asking people with certain models to park outside after reports of some under-the-hood fires while the cars were off. The company is also recalling more than 300,000 trucks because the driver's airbag may not inflate in a crash. We've got more info. If you have a Ford truck or SUV, more info on our website. Number 5, Rihanna has a new title under her belt, Mom. Riri had a baby, the singer, welcoming her first kiddo, a baby boy, with partner A$AP Rocky. He was born last week in L.A. We don't know the name yet. Are you excited to find out? We sure are. A big congratulations to them both. What a gift. Still to come. Georgia's Secretary of State is feeling the pressure ahead of Tuesday's primary. We'll tell you what he's focusing on ahead of the election when we go live to Atlanta. Plus, we know mass shootings are on the rise, but some say there may be a way, maybe, to try to stop them from happening. That's tonight's original. Georgia, on the mind of the political world as voters get ready to head to the polls next Tuesday. This is where the oxygen in the political world is right now, this and PA, I guess. Check out this new Fox poll. This is big news if you follow politics, because it shows the guy at the top, the current governor, Brian Kemp, way up over his next closest competitor, former Senator David Perdue. 32 points, and Perdue's been endorsed by former President Donald Trump, right? So this is one of these Trump tests that we've been talking about in these races across the country. Georgia. Man, this is an interesting state. It's been a target for these lies about voter fraud since 2020. And the guy in charge of it all, Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, who is also running for re-election this year, is running, obviously, the election system. His opponent is backed by former President Trump, who was upset that Raffensperger would not, quote, find the votes to overturn the election when he called him after Election Day in 2020 and refused to overturn the legitimate election results in his state. That race with Raffensperger, look at this, statistical tie, basically, according to a recent poll, which raises the question, have Georgians gotten over 2020, or how is that still playing out?
Are you in a place with this election where you're essentially forced to fight against former President Trump?
I'm just leaning into the truth, and I'm leaning into the goodness of my fellow Georgians. I think that'll be, what'll get me across the finish line.
Joining me now is Blaine Alexander. And Blaine, let me give some context here as to why this particular race is so interesting, right, and so important on a national Democratic small d scale. 2 out of 3 Republican voters, according to polling, do not think President Biden was legitimately elected, right? They are believers of the big lie. When you look at Brad Raffensperger, he was one of a few folks in Georgia who in some ways held the line against this pressure now from former President Trump to try to overturn those legitimate results. That's got to be playing into this race. We know it is.
It absolutely is. Now, when you talk to Brad Raffensperger himself, he says that it's not. In fact, twice during our interview, he said that people have moved on. People are tired of talking about that. But when you look at everything that you just showed, that polling that shows that 2 out of 3 Republican voters believe the way they do, the polling that shows that he's in a statistical tie with his Trump-endorsed candidate, and even just the fact that 2020, really, like it or not, is the central issue in his race. It's something that Jody Hice brings up repeatedly. It's something that Brad Raffensperger himself told me when he goes out on campaign events. He goes out, he speaks to people in all corners of the state of Georgia, and he gets questions from the audience, essentially parroting the things that have come from Trump and his allies. So he has to spend part of his campaign stops knocking down false claim after false claim before he can even get into his own platform. I asked him about that during our interview. Take a look.
What would you have done differently in your handling of 2020?
We can't control what other people say. So how do you push back against the narrative and people with millions and millions of Twitter followers that put out disinformation and then outright falsehoods?
So, Hallie, he just keeps leaning in and saying that he's going to lean in on doing what's right, doing his job, leaning in on the truth, as he told me several times, and he believes that's what's going to take him ultimately across the finish line. But 2020 is the central issue in his race, Hallie.
Well, and in another one, I think is fair to say, which is the governor's race in Georgia. There's a lot going on in your state, Blaine, because it looks like if, again, the current governor, Brian Kemp, leading former Senator David Perdue, who has been backed by Donald Trump. If Brian Kemp wins, looks like he's going up against Stacey Abrams, potentially, rematch of 2018.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm sorry, I cut you off, but I was going to say, I think that all of this really, it says more about Brian Kemp and his standing among Republicans and less about Donald Trump as the kingmaker. Because when you talk to people who support Brian Kemp, they are all in for him. And when you go to Brian Kemp's different events around the state, he focuses on his record, and that's it. He doesn't talk about David Perdue. He really doesn't talk about Donald Trump for 2020. He focuses on his record, and that is what people who support him really stand on. He's done a lot of things during his term that are very popular among conservatives. He's passed so-called constitutional carry, making it easier to get guns here in the state of Georgia. Georgia was the first state to reopen during COVID lockdowns. You remember that? That was very popular among Republicans. And of course, championing the controversial voting bill here in Georgia as well. So that's something that he repeatedly talks about. And I've got to say, one thing that was interesting when I talked to Kemp supporters, they're also Trump supporters. They say they support the former president. However, that doesn't knock their support of Brian Kemp. In fact, one woman said that Trump's attacks on Kemp only makes her want to support him more because she says it's unfair that he would be asked to do something that's illegal in terms of overturning the election. Hallie.
Blaine Alexander live for us in Atlanta. Blaine, it's great to see you. And it'll be even better to see Blaine next week when we take this show on the road to Georgia next Tuesday, talking all things primary day, our first road show right here on NBC News Now. We want to bring you now tonight's original with in-depth reporting on a topic we've been keeping an eye on. The shooting at the Buffalo supermarket last week, the deadliest mass shooting in the U.S. this year, but just one of about 200 in 2022 alone, according to the Gun Violence Archive. And experts say these attacks are often planned with some warning signs behaviorally. NBC's Ken Delaney takes a look at how a combination of mental health counseling and police work may help before it's too late.
Another mass shooting and another missed opportunity to stop one. Law enforcement officials say the alleged Buffalo shooter was planning violence for months, but the police failed to discover it, even when they detained him over an alleged threat to kill.
So you had an at-risk individual who was raising serious concern to the point where he was taken into custody reportedly and had a mental health evaluation. But then that was kind of the end of it, as far as we know.
In chat logs reviewed by NBC News, the suspect wrote that his mental health evaluation consisted of a 15-minute conversation in an emergency room where he lied and said his threat was a joke.
Once the individual gets in front of somebody who's a professional, they say, I didn't mean it. I was just kidding. I was just kidding. Then it just becomes words, and there's not really anything else that law enforcement can do to hold him.
Mark Folman wrote a book about efforts to stop mass shootings. He says he's seen how they can be prevented, but there are huge gaps in the system.
Many of these are planned acts of violence, and they're preceded by behavioral warning signs that are often detectable to people around the perpetrators. And so there's more that we can do to step in and try to intervene and get in the way of this problem.
Folman embedded with mass shooting experts and saw how mental health counseling could steer troubled people off the path to violence. That didn't happen in the case of 18-year-old shooting suspect Peyton Gendron, the latest in a string of accused killers to appear on law enforcement's radar before allegedly carrying out a mass shooting. Just last week, NBC News reported on the FBI's 2016 encounter with a young New Mexico man who posted a threat online. He convinced the agents he didn't mean it, and the FBI closed the case. Months later, he carried out a school shooting.
The law enforcement mentality on cases such as this is to, particularly at the patrol level, is to evaluate as to whether a crime has been committed or is about to be committed. So it's an evaluation of imminent risk. With that kind of mentality, you're taking just a very, very thin lateral slice of behavior.
Forensic psychologist Reed Malloy consults for the FBI. He's an expert in the field of threat assessment and behavioral intervention.
We're looking at how the person's changing in terms of his thinking, his feelings, and his activities, and then engaging with that person from a social services perspective, from a mental health perspective.
Sometimes, Malloy says, just having a police officer visit a troubled, isolated person can make a difference. Experts say someone planning a mass shooting will almost always talk about it with a friend or relative or write about it on social media. But when a threat intervention team moves in, it's more likely to be discovered.
The act that unfolded in Buffalo, New York, was an act of targeted predatory violence. These acts can be prevented.
Ken Delanian, NBC News, Washington.
Still ahead, California officials find a car that looks like it's something out of a James Bond movie. We're going to show you. Look at that. Coming up in the local, more details ahead. And is an elephant a person? That's not a riddle. That's an actual case playing out in court. We're going to break that down for you after the break. NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day. And because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our Southeast Bureau, the Mesquite heat fire in Taylor County, Texas, has burned more than 7,000 acres, destroyed nearly 60 homes. Firefighters are working as fast as they can, but only 10% of this thing is contained right now. They've put an evacuation order in effect for most of the area. From our West Coast Bureau, check out this car linked to a burglary investigation in Irvine, California. So it looks like a normal Benz, right? A typical Mercedes-Benz. But it has a license plate flipper and a gas siphoning device that transfers fuel directly into the tank. You can actually, can we play that again? You can flip your license plate. You can go do something, flip your license plate and be gone. Police arrested the owners of the car and called it something out of a 007 movie. And from our Northeast Bureau, there's apparently more Airbnb listings than available apartments for rent in New York City. That's right, more than 13,000 Airbnbs in the 5 boroughs right now, but only about 7,000 apartments. Not great news for people who are already feeling the pinch of a very hot and very expensive housing market there. Right now, speaking of New York, judges there are deciding a fascinating question: whether an elephant can legally be considered a person. Yeah, it's part of this really closely watched case to figure out, can basic human rights be extended to animals? The Non-Human Rights Project argues in court that Happy, look at Happy, 51-year-old elephant, that she's self-aware, that she's autonomous, that she's entitled to the same rights as a human. They say if she's considered a person, being kept at the Bronx Zoo would be illegal imprisonment. They want her at a sanctuary. But the Bronx Zoo is saying, no, hang on, Happy is definitely just an elephant. And they say, by the way, she's also being treated really well at the zoo. Danny Savalos joins me now to explain. So, Danny, the court is now deciding as we speak. We don't know the timeline, but they're deciding now, is an elephant entitled to the same human rights as a person? This Human Rights Project says Happy should get to be able to go to court over what they see as her illegal imprisonment. Talk about the evidence here.
Human Rights Project is arguing for personhood for Happy, but even they admit that personhood is not the same thing as a human being. Personhood has had kind of a hazy definition in American law over the last several centuries, and that includes going back to English common law. A corporation can be a person, but sometimes a fetus is not a person. So personhood and human being are not always the same thing, and even Human Rights Project, they're not even arguing that. But on the other hand, they do argue that because we have extended personhood in many different ways to things like corporations, well, Happy has autonomy, and therefore he has some right to liberty. Now, the respondents, the Bronx Zoo, they're arguing essentially, number one, essentially, who are you to say where Happy would be happier? You say that, you know what, there's no discussion of what's best for Happy. Instead, there's an argument that Happy must be a person. But assuming we can figure that out, and assuming Happy does have this autonomy, well, then now what? How do we figure out what exactly it is that he wants? And they also point out that no court has ever granted personhood to an animal for purposes of what's called habeas corpus. And that's what's being used here. It's a vehicle to challenge someone's detention, usually in prison or detention by the police or something like that.
We've been showing pictures in court of the arguments that went down about 24 hours ago. Let me play what one of the members of the court had to say.
So does that mean that I couldn't keep a dog? I mean, dogs can memorize words. Why isn't then what you're arguing for endangering these kinds of human-animal relationships?
So what was the response? Because the question seems to be, hey, if we grant personhood to Happy the elephant, what stops us from granting personhood to, you know, Rex my dog or, you know, Stinky the rat or whatever?
It is the slipperiest of slippery slopes. I mean, if you grant personhood to Happy, then what's to prevent us from never eating a steak or a hamburger again? Because those come from animals that arguably have feelings or autonomy or arguably personhood. So you're exactly right that the justice in that case sees on an important issue. And the other thing, too, is that even if the petitioners are right and Happy does have a right to liberty, well, first, how do you find out where Happy wants to be? Maybe Happy likes where he is more than this sanctuary that they want to send him to. I mean, when you take most children, for example, want to stay where they are rather than go to some new unfamiliar place. Happy might be the same way. And then what if Happy's right to liberty? What if we determine what Happy wants and Happy wants to just wander through the streets of New York? We can't really have that either. So this is a very slippery slope. And the judges appear to be aware of that.
The Non-Human Rights Project has more than 1.5 million people, I think 1.4 million people who have signed on to this change.org petition who backs this, right? And let's be honest, elephants, there is this sort of cultural feeling towards elephants because they are incredibly intelligent animals and they do have a sense of community. And there's this really interesting research that's been done there. But if you look from a legal perspective in lower courts, a couple of them have sided with the Bronx Zoo before. So give me your Danny Savalos lawyer hat reality check on this one, because it's a fascinating case. But where does this go? How do you think it's going to go and when?
I can see the judge concluding or siding with the respondents in this case, with the Bronx Zoo, essentially saying that, look, even if animals are persons, we've never recognized that animals can challenge their detention because arguably virtually every animal in the city of New York is detained on some level other than the rats and the pigeons. But for the most part, we detain our animals. And by the way, I can find plenty of dog owners, especially in this city, who probably think their dog, their sweet Snookums or Fluffy, is even smarter than Happy the elephant. And so it is, again, what are we going to start here? And I wouldn't be surprised if the New York court doesn't want to open up that can of worms, which non-intelligent or intelligent worms, either way.
Danny Savalos, thank you for that. What a show we have here, gang, right? I mean, we talk about anything on this program. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Let's talk about what's happening with Boeing, because they're hoping that the third time will be the charm tonight, trying again to launch an unmanned flight to the International Space Station. And yes, I said Boeing, not SpaceX. Okay, Elon Musk's company, SpaceX, they've had a lot of success in the last few years launching both manned and unmanned flights into space. But Boeing, they've had a tougher time. They've tried this twice already. Both times it didn't work. So tonight, it kind of feels like they want to prove to everybody they can get to space, too. Joining me now is Carrie Sanders. Carrie, is the pressure on for Boeing? Why now, and what's the plan here?
Well, absolutely, the pressure is on. I mean, what you have is this capsule, the Starliner capsule, which sits atop the Atlas V rocket. The Atlas V rocket, proven. It does really well. This will be the 150th launch of an Atlas rocket. It's the actual Starliner capsule that's going up, and the pressure is not only to get it into orbit, to then get it unmanned now to the International Space Station to dock and then to undock and make its way back to Earth. And that's where the real pressure is. And so it looks like, according to the weather, that everything is good to go for launch. The real question is getting this up into orbit and then having that capsule make its way about 24 hours after launch, which will happen around after 7 o'clock tonight, if everything goes as planned, and actually connecting to the space station. Hallie.
Talk about how meaningful this is to Boeing, which has kind of gone through it over the last few years. You had those 737 MAX crashes. You had, COVID, which affected the entire aviation industry. The 2 times they tried to do the launch before and it didn't work. Then you have other companies like SpaceX that have had success. What's on the line for Boeing?
Yeah, exactly. And so the pressure, well, it's not only pressure on Boeing, but it's actually pressure for NASA because they would like to have more than one system to rely on. The idea is to have SpaceX and Boeing so that they can have continuous, kind of like Uber and Lyft. You want to have 2 different ways to get to the International Space Station. And so there's really pressure to deliver. But remember, this all has to be done safely. That's why it's unmanned. But you do need to know on board there is Rosie the Rocketeer. And she's in the command position. She's autonomous, but she will be taking in with her 15 sensors all of the different data during this mission and feeding back. So when they get to the point of putting humans on board, they will actually know what Rosie the Rocketeer hopefully will provide about what that flight inside that capsule is like.
So unmanned, but perhaps not unwomaned. Carrie Sanders, thank you so much. Good to see you. Appreciate it. That's a wrap for this hour. We're going to have more for you here tomorrow. Same time, same place. Glad you're with us. Coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.